Welcome to Lit Happens. Today, we're diving into the absolutely wild story of the English language. You know, it's this global powerhouse now, but it almost didn't make it through the Middle Ages. Its story isn't some gentle, predictable evolution. Oh no, it's a dramatic tale of survival against all odds. We're going to explore how English got conquered, pushed aside, and nearly vanished, only to be saved by a series of unbelievable, world-changing events. Okay, let's get into it.
So this is the big question, right? How did we get here? Well, the survival of English really hinges on this trio of unlikely heroes. A devastating plague that completely reshaped society, a brilliant poet who made the language cool again, and a revolutionary machine that literally pressed it all into place. It's a chain of events that, honestly, nobody could have seen coming. So here's our roadmap. We're going to walk through 5 key moments. First, we'll see how English was basically toppled from power. Then we'll watch its shocking comeback, all thanks to a public health disaster. We'll meet the writer who became its ultimate champion, see how one dialect beat out all the others, and finally, discover the piece of tech that cemented English for centuries.
Okay, our story really kicks off with an invasion. We're talking 1066, the Norman Conquest. This wasn't just about who got to sit on the throne of England. It was a seismic shift that totally upended the country's language, its culture, and its social ladder for the next 300 years.
This timeline really puts it into perspective. It shows you just how long English was pushed to the sidelines. The Norman Conquest in 1066 starts this nearly 300-year-long era where French and Latin were the top dogs. It wasn't until 1362, with something called the Statute of Pleading, that English even started to officially get back in the game.
And here's the crucial thing to understand. Overnight, the language of the land, Anglo-Saxon English, just lost all its status. Poof! It was no longer the language of the government or a fancy culture. It was basically demoted to an unwritten dialect, a patois, spoken only by the common folks, the conquered people with no power.
And in its place, 2 other languages moved in and took over the neighborhood. You had the new Norman elite, and they all spoke French. That was the language of power, of the royal courts, of running the country. And at the same time, you had Latin, which was still the official language of the church, of the law, and of all the smart scholarly stuff. English was just squeezed out of every important part of life.
The influence of French was just immense. It's estimated that during this time, a staggering 10,000 French words flooded into the English language. 10,000! It completely transformed English vocabulary forever. All these words related to government, law, art, food, fashion. Yep, they all came from French.
And this is such a brilliant way to see that social divide. The English-speaking peasants, they were out on the farm, raising the cow, the pig, and the sheep. But the French-speaking nobles, sitting at the fancy dinner table, they ate beef, pork, and mutton. The language itself shows you who was doing the work and who was enjoying the meal.
So let's move on to our second act. For centuries, English is stuck as the language of the lower classes. But then, a catastrophe hits Europe that, weirdly enough, would become the single most important event in saving the English language. I'm talking about the Black Death. The scale of the Black Death is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Between 1348 and 1349, this plague killed up to half of the entire population of England. It was a demographic collapse that just shattered the medieval world and its rigid social structure.
Now, what's so fascinating here is you can see the chain of events, like dominoes falling. The plague didn't care if you were rich or poor. It killed tons of the French-speaking nobles and Latin-speaking clergy. This created a massive labor shortage. All of a sudden, the English-speaking peasants and workers who survived were in super high demand. They could demand more money, their economic power shot up, and as their status in society rose, well, so did the status of the language they spoke.
So, this newly empowered English language needed a champion, someone to prove it could be more than just the language of the marketplace. It needed a literary genius, and boy, did it find one in Chaucer. Chaucer wasn't just some poet scribbling away in an attic. This guy was a big deal. He was a courtier, a diplomat. He moved in the highest circles of power. So when he chose to write his greatest works in English, instead of the more respectable French or Latin, that was a huge statement about the language's value. And just listen to this, the very opening of his masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, in the original Middle English. One that April with his showers suit, the drought of March hath pierced to the root. It sounds a little different, sure, but you can hear our language in there, can't you? This is the English that Chaucer took and elevated into great art. So you have to get this. Chaucer's work wasn't just good entertainment. It was a cultural declaration of independence. He proved once and for all that English was rich, it was flexible, it was sophisticated, and it was totally capable of producing literature just as amazing as anything else in the world. But here's the thing. Chaucer's English wasn't the only kind of English being spoken. At the time, England was basically a patchwork of different regional dialects. If the language was ever going to truly unite the country, one of those dialects had to rise up and become the standard. So, the dialect that ended up winning was called East Midland, and it won for a few really powerful reasons. First, it was the dialect of London, the political and economic center of everything. It was also the language you'd hear at the big shot universities, Oxford and Cambridge. Geographically, it was kind of in the middle, so it was a good compromise that people from the north and south could both pretty much understand. And maybe most importantly, it had the star power of being the dialect used by Chaucer himself.
And now we come to the final act. The East Midland dialect is on its way to becoming the standard, but something was needed to make it permanent, to spread it everywhere and lock it in. That something was a technological revolution.
In 1476, a merchant named William Caxton brought the very first printing press to England. And this one invention would do more to standardize and spread the English language than any king or any law ever could. It was a total game changer. The impact was just immediate. I mean, before printing, spelling was all over the place, a total mess. Afterwards, the press started to make it standard. Before, you had all these regional dialects. Afterwards, the London-based dialect that Caxton used was mass-produced and sent everywhere. Books went from being copied slowly one by hand to being printed and spread with incredible speed.
But, and this is a really big but, here's the great paradox of the printing press. Yeah, it standardized spelling, but it also kind of froze it in time based on how people pronounced words back in the 15th century. Our pronunciation has kept changing for the last 500 years, but our spelling, it's pretty much stayed the same. And that right there is why we have that infamous, crazy gap between how we write English and how we actually say it.
Which brings us to one last thing to chew on. The story of English is all about change, driven by invasions, by society shifting, and by technology. The printing press was the great standardizer of its time. So it kind of makes you wonder, right? What forces are standardizing or maybe even fracturing our language here in the 21st century? The internet, social media, AI? It's definitely something to think about.